On April 28th, 1945, just 2 days before putting a bullet through his temple inside a damp, claustrophobic bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin, Adolf Hitler received news that made him tremble with rage more than any Allied bombing, more than any defeat on the Eastern Front, more than the loss of Stalingrad. The news did not come from the enemy. It came from one of his closest men, from someone he himself had named his successor, from someone who had stood by his side for years, swearing absolute loyalty. Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer of the SS, the architect of the Holocaust, the man who had built the most efficient death machine in history, had just betrayed him. He was secretly negotiating the surrender of Germany with the Allies, behind Hitler's back, without his permission, without his knowledge. But that was not all, because Himmler was not the only one, nor was he the first. The story of the last days of the Third Reich is, in fact, the story of a chain of betrayals, so surprising, so twisted, so full of unexpected turns, that if it were fiction, no one would believe it. Generals who conspired to assassinate Hitler, ministers who secretly negotiated with the enemy, officers who deserted, taking state secrets with them, allies who became mortal enemies, and at the center of it all, a paranoid, deteriorating man, addicted to drugs, locked in an underground bunker, giving orders to armies that no longer existed, moving phantom divisions on maps while Berlin burned above his head. How was it possible for the most controlling, most vigilant, most ruthless regime in modern history to crumble from within? What led Hitler's most loyal men to turn their backs on him just when he needed them most? And what secrets did they take with them to the grave? Before you get comfortable, take a moment to give the video a good like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from all over the world, because what we are going to tell today is not just the chronicle of a military defeat. It is the X-ray of a regime that devoured itself. It is the story of how absolute loyalty became absolute betrayal. And it is above all a warning. Because the betrayals that destroyed the Third Reich from within did not arise out of nowhere. They were the logical, inevitable result of a system built on fear, lies, and ruthless competition among the Nazi hierarchs themselves. To understand how it all ended, you have to understand how it began to crumble. And for that, we have to go back, not to 1945, not even to 1944. We have to go much further back. Let's go to 1943. In February of that year, the German Sixth Army surrendered at Stalingrad. It was the first great catastrophic defeat of the Wehrmacht in the war, and the psychological impact was devastating. More than 300,000 German soldiers had been trapped in a Soviet encirclement. Hitler had refused to allow them to retreat. He had ordered them to fight to the last man. And when Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus finally surrendered on February 2nd, 1943, Hitler flew into a rage. Not for the dead soldiers, not for the strategic defeat, but because Paulus had not committed suicide. Hitler had granted him the rank of Field Marshal precisely because no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered in history. He expected Paulus to understand the message, that he would shoot himself before being taken prisoner. But Paulus chose to live. And that decision, apparently simple, was the first visible crack in the facade of absolute loyalty that sustained the regime. Because if a field marshal could disobey an implicit order from Hitler, what prevented others from doing so? What prevented generals, admirals, ministers from beginning to think for themselves? What prevented them from starting to look for a way out? The answer is nothing, and many were already doing it. But let's go step by step, because the story of the betrayals within Hitler's circle is much more complex than it first appears. It is not about a group of organized conspirators who suddenly decided to overthrow the dictator. It is about dozens of parallel, often contradictory plots, led by men who hated each other as much as they hated or feared Hitler. Men who competed fiercely for power, for resources, for the Führer's attention, and who, when the ship began to sink, each tried to save himself, stepping on the heads of others if necessary. To understand this dynamic, one must first understand how power worked within the Third Reich, and this is where the story becomes truly fascinating. Hitler did not govern like a conventional dictator. He did not have an organized cabinet with clear functions. He did not hold regular government meetings. He did not delegate in an orderly manner. Instead, he had created a deliberately chaotic system in which the competencies of the different ministries, agencies, and organizations constantly overlapped. The result was a perpetual war among the Nazi hierarchs themselves to define who had authority over what. Why did he do this? Because the chaos suited him. As long as his subordinates fought among themselves, none would accumulate enough power to threaten him. As long as they all competed for his favor, they would all depend on him. It was a strategy of divide and conquer taken to the extreme, and for years it worked perfectly. Hermann Göring, the regime's number 2, commander of the Luftwaffe, president of the Reichstag, plenipotentiary of the four-year plan, accumulated titles and powers that overlapped with those of half the government. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and the Gestapo, had built a state within a state, with his own army, his own intelligence, his own concentration camps, even his own factories. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, controlled information and public opinion with an iron fist, but constantly clashed with Alfred Rosenberg, the party's official ideologue, and with Otto Dietrich, the Reich's press chief. Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary and head of the party chancellery, had become the Führer's gatekeeper. No one accessed Hitler without going through him, which gave him enormous power but also made him enormously hated. Albert Speer, the favourite architect turned armaments minister, tried to keep war production running, while Himmler's SS stole slave labour and Göring's Luftwaffe hoarded resources. Joachim von Ribbentrop, Minister of Foreign Affairs, was despised by almost all his colleagues, but kept his post because Hitler found him useful. And then there were the military men. The OKW, High Command of the Wehrmacht, under Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl, who had become little more than Hitler's amanuenses, transmitting his orders without question, which earned them the contempt of the professional officer corps. This system of constant rivalries generated an atmosphere of permanent distrust. Everyone watched everyone. Everyone plotted against everyone. And everyone, absolutely everyone, lied to Hitler. They told him what he wanted to hear. They inflated production figures. They minimized defeats. They hid problems. Because telling Hitler the truth was dangerous. Very dangerous. And here we arrive at a crucial point. Because Hitler's paranoia was not unfounded. It was not an invention of his deteriorating mind. It was a response, perhaps exaggerated, but based on reality, to a system that he himself had created, a system where betrayal was not the exception, it was the norm. The first major conspiracy against Hitler did not emerge in 1944, as many believe. It emerged much earlier. As early as 1938, a group of army officers and government officials conspired to overthrow Hitler before he invaded Czechoslovakia. The plan, known as the Oster Conspiracy, is named after Colonel Hans Oster, Deputy Chief of the Abwehr, the military intelligence service led by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. The plan was simple in theory. When Hitler gave the order to invade Czechoslovakia, the conspirators would arrest the Führer and declare him mentally incompetent. But the plan failed before it could be executed. Why? Because the Munich Agreement, signed in September 1938, handed the Sudetenland to Germany without a war. Great Britain and France, led by Neville Chamberlain and Edouard Daladier, yielded to Hitler's demands in the name of peace, and in doing so, they unwittingly delegitimized the conspirators. How to justify a coup against a leader who had just achieved a spectacular diplomatic victory without firing a single shot? The conspirators dispersed, but they did not disappear. Admiral Canaris, chief of the Abwehr, is one of the most enigmatic figures of the entire Second World War. Officially, he was Hitler's spy master. In practice, he had been sabotaging the regime from within for years. Canaris provided information to the Allies. He helped Jews escape from Germany. He protected conspirators within his organization. And he did it all while maintaining a facade of impeccable loyalty, attending meetings with Hitler, dining with Himmler, exchanging reports with Heydrich. How did he manage it for so long? How is it possible that the spy chief of one of the most vigilant regimes in history was himself an undercover spy against that regime? The answer has to do, in part, with the very nature of the Abwehr. Unlike the SS or the Gestapo, the Abwehr was a traditional military organization, heir to a long tradition of Prussian intelligence. Many of its officers were career professionals who despised the Nazis, considering them upstarts, beer hall thugs turned rulers. Canaris shared this contempt, though he hid it carefully, and his position as spy chief gave him a crucial advantage. He knew where the microphones were. He knew the surveillance methods. He understood how the regime's control machinery worked. He could navigate it because he knew it from the inside. But Canaris was not alone. His subordinate, Hans Oster, was even bolder. Oster had leaked the invasion plans for Norway, Denmark, Belgium, and the Netherlands to the Allies before they were executed. He had done so through the Dutch military attaché in Berlin, Colonel Jacobus Sass, to whom he regularly passed information. This was not a theoretical conspiracy. It was active treason in wartime. If they had been discovered, their execution would have been immediate. And they were not discovered, not at that moment. It would be years before Himmler and his security apparatus unraveled the network of conspirators within the Abwehr, and when they finally did, the consequences were devastating. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, because before we get to the fall of the Abwehr, we must talk about another act of treason that shook the foundations of the Third Reich, one that came not from the military or the spies, but from Hitler's own lieutenant, from the man who for 2 decades had been his shadow, his secretary, his confidant, his designated heir. In the bunker, paranoia, fear, and desperation dominated everything. Do you think any of Hitler's associates truly believed in him until the end, or were they just waiting for the collapse? Let me know your opinion in the comments. Rudolf Hess. On May 10th, 1941, Rudolf Hess did something that stunned the entire world. He boarded a Messerschmitt Bf 110, took off from Augsburg, flew solo across the North Sea, and parachuted into Scotland. His objective, to reach the Duke of Hamilton, a British aristocrat he believed was a peace sympathiser, and negotiate a deal between Germany and Great Britain. He wanted to convince the British to join Germany, or at least remain neutral, while Hitler prepared to invade the Soviet Union. Hitler's reaction was explosive. When he was informed of what Hess had done, his fury was such that some present feared he would have a collapse. Hitler immediately declared that Hess was crazy, that he had acted on his own, that he did not represent the German government. Bormann rushed to draft an official statement, claiming that Hess suffered from hallucinations and was under the influence of astrologers and quacks. But was Hess really crazy, or did he act with some prior knowledge from Hitler? This is one of the most debated questions by historians, and the answer is still not entirely clear. What we do know is that Hess had been obsessed for months with the idea of negotiating peace with Great Britain. He had consulted with Karl Haushofer, the geopolitician who had greatly influenced Nazi expansionist ideology, and with his son Albrecht Haushofer, who had contacts in British circles. Hess genuinely believed he could achieve what formal diplomacy had failed to do. He believed that if he presented himself personally to the British, man to man, he could convince them of Germany's goodwill. He was profoundly mistaken. The British arrested him immediately. They interrogated him for weeks, and they kept him prisoner for the rest of the war. Churchill had no interest in negotiating with the Nazis. and even less so through a self-appointed envoy who had arrived by parachute like a character from a novel. But the damage to Hitler was enormous, not so much military as political and psychological, because Hess's flight demonstrated something Hitler could not tolerate, that someone from his innermost circle was capable of acting independently, of making decisions without his approval, of challenging his absolute authority. And if Hess could do it, who else could? Hitler's paranoia, which was already considerable before May 1941, intensified dramatically after the Hess episode. The consequences were immediate. A purge was unleashed against astrologers, occultists, and anyone who had had contact with Hess. The Gestapo arrested hundreds of people, and Bormann, who until then had been just one of Hitler's subordinates, took advantage of the vacuum left by Hess to consolidate his power. He became the new secretary of the Führer, the new guardian of the gate. And unlike Hess, who was a clumsy idealist, Bormann was a ruthless, cunning, vengeful political operator. His rise would profoundly mark the power dynamics within Hitler's circle in the following years. But let's continue, because the story of Betrayals is just beginning. While Hess languished in a British prison and Bormann consolidated his power in Berlin, the war was transforming. The invasion of the Soviet Union, launched on June 22, 1941, under the codename Operation Barbarossa, was Hitler's greatest strategic mistake. What was planned as a lightning campaign of a few weeks turned into an endless hell. The German army advanced hundreds of kilometers, captured millions of Soviet prisoners, razed entire cities, but it failed to achieve its main objective, to destroy the Red Army and force Stalin's surrender. The winter of 1941 was devastating. The German troops, without proper equipment for the extreme cold, froze on the outskirts of Moscow. And when the Soviet counteroffensive pushed them back, Hitler made a decision that would have enormous consequences. He appointed himself Commander-in-Chief of the army, dismissing Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch. From that moment on, Hitler would personally direct military operations from his headquarters. This decision was viewed with horror by many officers of the General Staff. Not because they doubted Hitler's authority, most remained loyal, but because they knew that Hitler was not a professional military man. His combat experience was limited to being a corporal in the First World War. He did not understand logistics, supply chains, or the real limitations of his troops. And most dangerously, he did not tolerate being told no. As the war in the East became increasingly bloody, the frictions between Hitler and his generals multiplied. Hitler insisted on not one-step back orders that often resulted in the encirclement and destruction of entire units. Generals who dared to suggest tactical withdrawals were dismissed, humiliated, or worse. In the course of the war, Hitler dismissed dozens of generals. Some were tried before military tribunals, others simply disappeared. And it was in this context of growing frustration, fear, and desperation that the most famous and dramatic conspiracy against Hitler germinated, the plot of July 20th, 1944. What exactly happened that day? Who was behind it? And how is it possible that such a meticulously prepared plan failed in the most absurdly imaginable way? To answer these questions, one must know a man, Colonel Klaus Schenk Graf von Stauffenberg, a Catholic aristocrat, a veteran of the North African campaigns, where he had lost an eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers of his left hand, when his vehicle was attacked by an Allied plane. A man who, despite his terrible injuries, refused to retire from active service. A man who, by 1943, had come to the conclusion that Hitler was destroying Germany, and that the only way to save what was left was to eliminate him. Stauffenberg was not a lone dissident. He belonged to a broad network of conspirators that included generals, diplomats, politicians, aristocrats, and ecclesiastics. The German resistance against Hitler was much broader than is generally believed, although also much more fragmented and less effective. There were military resistance groups, like the one led by General Ludwig Beck, former chief of the Army General Staff, who had resigned in 1938 in protest of Hitler's war plans. There were civilian circles, like the Kreisau Circle, led by Helmut James Graf von Moltke and Peter York von Wartenberg, who planned a political and social order for post-war Germany. There were clandestine social democrats, communists, priests, Protestant pastors, but they all shared one problem: to change the regime, one first had to eliminate Hitler, and that was extraordinarily difficult. Hitler was a man protected like few others in history. His personal security was in the hands of the Reich Sicherheitsdienst, RSD, an elite SS unit under the command of SS Gruppenführer Hans Rattenhuber. The security protocols were extreme. Hitler constantly changed his schedules, his routes, his travel plans. He rarely appeared in public. Since the failed assassination attempt at the Bürgerbraukeller beer hall in Munich in November 1939, perpetrated by the carpenter Georg Elser, security measures had been enormously tightened. Every person who approached the Führer was searched. Food was tested before he ate it. The buildings where he met were meticulously inspected. But Stauffenberg had an advantage. As Chief of Staff of the Reserve Army, he had direct access to the briefing meetings with Hitler at the Führer's headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, Wolfschanze, in Rastenburg, East Prussia. He could enter the same room as Hitler. He could get close to him. He could be just a few meters away. And that is exactly what he did. On July 20th, 1944, Stauffenberg arrived at the Wolf's Lair with a briefcase containing a plastic bomb with a time fuse. The plan was simple: place the briefcase under the conference table, as close to Hitler as possible, activate the fuse, leave the room with some excuse, and wait for the explosion. Once Hitler's death was confirmed, the conspirators in Berlin would activate Operation Valkyrie, an emergency plan originally designed to mobilize the reserve army in case of internal unrest, but which the conspirators had secretly modified to use as an instrument of a coup. The reserve army troops would take control of Berlin, arrest the Nazi leaders, and a provisional government under General Beck and the politician Karl Goerdeler would assume power. But everything went wrong, terribly wrong. Stauffenberg activated the fuse in a bathroom before the meeting. He had 2 packs of explosive, but only managed to arm one. His hand injuries made manipulation extremely difficult, and he was interrupted before preparing the second. This reduced the bomb's power by about half. Still, it would have been enough to kill everyone present if the meeting had been held, as planned, in the concrete underground bunker, where the blast wave would have been contained. But that day, due to the summer heat, the meeting was moved to a wooden barrack with open windows, where the blast wave would partially dissipate. Stauffenberg placed the briefcase under the table near Hitler. Then he left the room with the excuse of making a phone call. Minutes later, the bomb exploded. The explosion was devastating. The barrack was destroyed. 4 people died. More than 20 were injured. But Hitler survived. He suffered perforated eardrums, burns, an injured arm, and tattered trousers. But he was alive. The thick, solid oak table had deflected part of the blast wave, and the fact that the meeting was in a wooden structure with open windows instead of the concrete bunker allowed the pressure to escape. There is another detail that many historians consider crucial. After Stauffenberg placed the briefcase, Colonel Heinz Brandt, one of the officers present, moved it with his foot because it was bothering him. He pushed it to the other side of one of the thick table supports, away from Hitler. That small, unconscious, trivial gesture may have saved the dictator's life and changed the course of history. Stauffenberg, who was outside when the explosion occurred, saw the destruction and assumed that no one could have survived. He headed to the airfield, took a plane to Berlin, and began to coordinate the coup. But the following hours were a disaster of indecision, confusion, and cowardice. General Friedrich Olbricht, one of the key conspirators in Berlin, hesitated for hours before activating Operation Valkyrie. Why? because he did not have definitive confirmation that Hitler was dead. And without that confirmation, giving the order to mobilize the troops was an enormous risk. If Hitler was alive, the coup would fail and they would all be executed. Albrecht waited, and he waited. And in those hours of waiting, the opportunity slipped away. When Stauffenberg arrived in Berlin and personally confirmed that the bomb had exploded, Valkyrie was finally activated. The reserve army troops began to move. In Paris, the conspirators acted decisively. General Karl Heinrich von Stuhlnagel ordered the arrest of all SS and Gestapo officers in France, and for a few hours, the operation was a success. More than 1,200 SS officers were detained. It was the only place where the coup worked, albeit briefly. But in Berlin, the chaos was total. The conspirators' orders clashed with the counter-orders from Hitler's loyalists. Major Otto Ernst Reimer, commander of the Berlin Guard Battalion, had received orders from the conspirators to surround the government district, but Reimer hesitated, and in that moment of doubt, a man intervened who would change the fate of the coup, Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels, who was in his Berlin residence when the coup began, immediately realized what was happening. With extraordinary cold-bloodedness, he did something none of the conspirators had foreseen. He called the Wolf's Lair, managed to get Hitler on the phone, and passed the receiver to Reimer. Hitler spoke directly to the major. He ordered him to crush the coup. He promoted him to colonel on the spot, and he gave him a free hand to act. Reimer obeyed. His troops, which until minutes before had been carrying out the conspirators' orders, switched sides. The coup collapsed in a matter of hours. That same night, the main conspirators were arrested in the General Staff building on Benderstrasse in Berlin. General Friedrich Fromm, commander of the Reserve Army, who had known about the plot but had not actively participated, and who now feared the conspirators would expose him, organized a summary trial. A few hours later, in the building's courtyard, in the headlights of a truck, Stauffenberg, Albrecht, Lieutenant Werner von Haeften, and Colonel Albrecht Merz von Kernheim was shot. Stauffenberg's last words, according to witnesses, were, "Long live sacred Germany." In the last days of the Third Reich, loyalty meant survival, but also complicity. What would you have done within Hitler's inner circle? Be loyal or betray him? Let me know your opinion in the comments. But Hitler's revenge was just beginning. What followed was the most brutal repression the Third Reich unleashed against its own citizens. Hitler was beside himself with rage. He demanded that the conspirators be hanged like cattle. And his wish was literally fulfilled. A special court, the Volksgerichtshof, was created, presided over by Judge Roland Freisler, a Nazi fanatic known for his humiliating trials and predetermined verdicts. The accused were presented before the court without belts, without suspenders, in clothes that were too big for them, deliberately. Humiliated, Freisler insulted them, shouted at them, did not let them speak. The sessions were filmed by order of Hitler, who wanted to watch the films in private. The executions were atrocious. The condemned were hung with piano wire from meat hooks in Plötzensee prison. They were left to strangle slowly. Some took more than 20 minutes to die. The executions were also filmed. In total, the repression after July 20th claimed the lives of some 5,000 people. Not just the direct conspirators, but their families, their friends, anyone who had had the slightest connection with them. The principle of Sippenhaft, collective family responsibility, was applied, a barbaric practice that punished entire families for the actions of one of their members. The wives and children of the conspirators were arrested, sent to concentration camps, separated from one another. The children's names were changed to erase all trace of their identity. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the most famous and popular German soldier, was implicated in the conspiracy. Had he really participated? The evidence is ambiguous. Rommel had privately expressed his conviction that the war was lost and that peace had to be negotiated. He had had contact with some of the conspirators, but there is no conclusive evidence that he knew of the assassination plan or approved it. However, for Hitler, that was enough. On October 14th, 1944, two generals appeared at Rommel's house in Herlingen. They gave him an ultimatum. He could commit suicide with a cyanide capsule, and in return, his family would be protected and he would receive a state funeral as a war hero. Or he could be tried before the Volksgerichtshof with the certainty of being condemned to death and the guarantee that his family would be destroyed. Rommel chose the poison. He said goodbye to his wife Lucy and his son Manfred, got into the general's car, and a few minutes later he was dead. The regime announced that he had died from wounds sustained in an Allied bombing months earlier. He was given a state funeral with full honours. Hitler sent a wreath of flowers. What do you think of the content? Do you like this type of video? Then comment the phrase, "I want more stories." This will encourage us to bring more historical topics, and you will also help the video's engagement, okay? Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave your like, so that YouTube keeps recommending our videos. The hypocrisy was absolute, and the cruelty unthinkable. But there is something that is even more disturbing than the brutality of the repression, and it is what the failure of July 20th revealed about the nature of the Nazi regime and about the mentality of the conspirators themselves. Because many of the men who tried to kill Hitler were not Democrats, they were not liberals, they were not pacifists. Many of them had enthusiastically supported Nazism in its early years. They had participated in Germany's military expansion. They had commanded troops in campaigns of conquest, and in some cases had been accomplices, directly or indirectly, of war crimes. What led them to conspire against Hitler was not, in most cases, a moral objection to anti-Semitism or the Holocaust. It was the pragmatic conviction that Hitler was leading Germany to military disaster. They wanted to save Germany, or at least what was left of it, by negotiating with the Western Allies before it was too late. This is an uncomfortable truth, but it is important to recognize it to understand the complexity of history. The July 20th conspirators were extraordinarily brave. They risked their lives and their families for what they believed was right. But their motivations were diverse, contradictory, and not always noble. History is rarely black or white. It is almost always grey. And what happened after July 20th? How did the failure of the plot affect the power dynamics within Hitler's circle during the final months of the war? The answer is devastating. The failure of July 20th had catastrophic consequences, not only for the conspirators, but for millions of people, because it consolidated the power of the most fanatical members of the regime and eliminated any possibility of negotiation, surrender, or internal resistance. Himmler was the great beneficiary. After July 20th, Hitler gave him command of the Reserve Army, the same army the conspirators had tried to use for the coup. Himmler, who had no military experience whatsoever, suddenly found himself commanding real armed forces. In addition to his SS, his power reached unprecedented levels, and he used it to intensify the terror. More executions, more shipments to concentration camps, more repression against any form of dissent. Goebbels also emerged stronger. Hitler appointed him plenipotentiary for total war, giving him extraordinary powers to mobilize all the resources of German society. Goebbels closed theaters, restricted mail, and expanded recruitment to include 15-year-old adolescents and 60-year-old men. The Germany of the last months of the war was a society militarized to the point of absurdity, where children of the Volkssturm, the popular militia, were sent to fight with obsolete weapons against Soviet tanks. Bormann, meanwhile, consolidated his position as the person closest to Hitler. He controlled access to the Führer with obsessive zeal. He filtered the information that reached Hitler, ensuring that he only received news that confirmed his delusions. And he used his position to destroy his internal rivals, whispering suspicions and accusations into Hitler's ear against anyone who cast a shadow on him. And Goering, the regime's number 2 official, Hitler's designated heir since 1941. What was he doing in the meantime? Goering had become a shadow of his former self, the man who had been the second most powerful Nazi in Germany, the commander of the Luftwaffe, the hero of the First World War, the bon vivant who collected stolen art and lived in palaces while Germany bled, was in freefall. His Luftwaffe had been destroyed. The skies of Germany belonged to the Allied bombers. Entire cities were reduced to rubble night after night, and Goering could do nothing to stop it. Hitler despised him more and more openly. In general staff meetings, he humiliated him in front of his subordinates. He blamed him for the destruction of German cities. He called him incompetent, lazy, corrupt, and Goering, who for years had been the public face of the regime, retreated to his estates, consuming morphine in ever-increasing quantities, surrounded by works of art that reminded him of better times. But Goering had not completely renounced his ambition, and that ambition would lead him, in the final hours of the Third Reich, to commit what Hitler considered the ultimate betrayal. But that comes later. First, let's go to another front, because while the betrayals within Hitler's circle multiplied, the war was accelerating towards its end, and with it, desperation. We enter 1945, the year of the end. At the beginning of January 1945, Germany's military situation was catastrophic. In the east, the Red Army was preparing to launch its final offensive. More than 6 million Soviet soldiers, supported by tens of thousands of tanks and planes, were deployed along a front that stretched from the Baltic to the Carpathians. Facing them, the German forces were a fraction of what they had been. Decimated divisions, without reserves, without fuel, without sufficient ammunition. In the West, the Allies had overcome the surprise of the Battle of the Bulge, the last German offensive on the Western Front, which had been launched in December 1944 and had failed miserably. American, British, and French troops were advancing towards the Rhine, the last natural barrier before the heart of Germany. In the south, Italy was practically lost. In the Balkans, Tito's partisans controlled Yugoslavia. In Scandinavia, the German garrison in Norway was isolated, and in the skies, Allied bombers operated practically without opposition, destroying what was left of industry, communications, and German cities. Hitler, holed up in the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, he had not yet moved permanently to the underground bunker, although he spent more and more time there, still believed in victory, or at least that's what he said. It is difficult to know what Hitler really thought in those last months. His health had deteriorated dramatically. He trembled constantly, probably due to Parkinson's disease, walked stooped, dragging his feet. His personal physician, Theodor Morell, daily injected him with a cocktail of substances that included methamphetamine, testosterone, animal organ extracts, and dozens of other compounds. Many historians believe that these injections worsened his condition rather than improving it. But beyond his physical state, what characterized Hitler in those months was a growing disconnect from reality. He kept talking about decisive counter-offensives, of miracle weapons that would change the course of the war, of divisions that did not exist, of reinforcements that would never arrive. His generals knew that none of this was real, but no one dared to tell him. Why? Because after July 20th, contradicting Hitler was equivalent to signing your own death sentence. The subsequent purge had eliminated not only the conspirators, but any general who had the courage or independence of mind to question the Führer's orders. Those who remained were, for the most part, men who owed their position to their blind obedience, not to their military competence. General Heinz Guderian, Chief of the Army General Staff since July 1944, was a partial exception. Guderian, one of the most brilliant tank strategists of the war, dared to argue with Hitler, and he did so frequently. The meetings between them became increasingly violent confrontations. On one occasion, according to witnesses, Guderian confronted Hitler so aggressively that Keitel had to physically intervene. grabbing Guderian by the arm to pull him out of the room. On another, Hitler shouted at him for half an hour without stopping. But even Guderian had his limits. And on March 28, 1945, Hitler dismissed him, sending him on leave for health reasons. Guderian was replaced by General Hans Krebs, an obedient and insignificant man who posed no threat to Hitler and no counterbalance to his delusions. The Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive, launched on January 12, 1945, was an unstoppable steamroller. In just 2 weeks, the Red Army advanced from the Vistula River in Poland to the Oder River, only 70 kilometers from Berlin. The speed of the advance was such that the German lines simply disintegrated. Entire divisions were surrounded and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of German civilians fled westward in the midst of the harshest winter, dragging their belongings on icy roads, pursued by Soviet tanks. The scenes of that exodus were of indescribable cruelty. Columns of refugees bombed, evacuation ships sunk in the Baltic, families separated in the chaos. And while all this was happening, while millions of people were suffering the consequences of a war that was already irretrievably lost, the Nazi hierarchs continued to maneuver, to intrigue, to betray. Because for many of them, the priority was no longer to win the war, it was to survive the end of the war. Himmler was the first to act, and his betrayal was the most spectacular. Since late 1944, Himmler had established secret contacts with the Allies through an unlikely intermediary, Count Volker Bernadotte, Vice President of the Swedish Red Cross and nephew of the King of Sweden. Bernadotte had travelled to Germany several times to negotiate the release of Scandinavian prisoners from concentration camps. Himmler saw an opportunity in him. What did Himmler intend? His plan was, seen from a distance, delusional. He wanted to negotiate a partial surrender of Germany to the Western Allies, the United States and Great Britain, while the war against the Soviet Union continued. Himmler believed that the Western Allies, fearful of the Soviet advance across Europe, would accept a separate agreement. And in this new order, Himmler saw himself as the leader of a reformed Germany, allied with the West against Bolshevism. It was a total fantasy. The Allies had agreed at the conferences of Casablanca, Tehran, and Yalta that they would only accept the unconditional surrender of Germany. There would be no separate agreements, there would be no exceptions, and certainly there would be no place in the future of Europe for the architect of the Holocaust. But Himmler, trapped in his own bubble of power, did not see it that way. He had begun to believe his own propaganda. He saw himself as a statesman, not a war criminal. He even told Bernadotte, with a seriousness that the Swede found chilling, "It is time for you, the Westerners, and I and Germany to come to an agreement. We must fight together against the real enemy, Bolshevism." The negotiations were carried out in the most absolute secrecy. They were held at Himmler's country estates, far from Berlin, far from Bormann's eyes, far from Hitler. Himmler believed he was being discreet, but he did not count on the information inevitably reaching the most dangerous place possible. It was the Reuters news agency that revealed it. On April 28, 1945, the BBC broadcast the news. Heinrich Himmler had tried to negotiate Germany's surrender with the Western Allies through Count Bernadotte. The offer had been rejected. When the news reached Hitler's bunker in Berlin, the effect was like a bomb. Hitler was devastated, not by the military defeat that he was already accepting in his own way, but by the personal betrayal. Himmler, the loyal Heinrich, the man who had built the SS according to Hitler's orders, the man who had supervised the final solution, the man who always said, "Mein Führer," with a reverence that bordered on civility. That man had betrayed him. According to the witnesses who were in the bunker that day, Hitler's reaction was the worst they had ever seen. Worse than after Stalingrad. Worse than after July 20th. Worse than after any defeat on the battlefield. Hitler turned red, then white. He trembled from head to toe. He shouted. He cursed. Some present said it looked like he was about to have a heart attack. And the first thing he did was order Himmler's arrest. But Himmler was not in the bunker. He was not in Berlin. He was somewhere in northern Germany, out of Hitler's reach. So Hitler did the second thing that occurred to him: execute Himmler's representative in the bunker. That man was SS Gruppenführer Hermann Fegelein, Eva Braun's brother-in-law. He was married to Hitler's mistress's sister, Gretel Braun. Fegelein was Himmler's liaison to Hitler's headquarters, and he was already in trouble before Himmler's betrayal was discovered. A few days earlier, Fegelein had disappeared from the bunker. He was found in his Berlin apartment, apparently preparing to flee. He had a suitcase full of cash, jewelry, false documents, and, according to some reports, a woman who was not his wife. He was arrested and returned to the bunker, where he was demoted and placed under surveillance. When the news of Himmler's betrayal arrived, Fegelein's fate was sealed. Eva Braun, despite being his sister-in-law, did not intercede for him. According to some witnesses, she didn't even try. Fegelein was subjected to a summary trial and shot in the gardens of the Reich Chancellery in the early morning of April 29th, 1945, one day before Hitler committed suicide. But Himmler's betrayal was not the only one that shook the bunker in those final days, because just a few hours earlier, another betrayal, or what Hitler considered as such, had caused another eruption of fury: Göring's betrayal. On April 23, 1945, 5 days before the news about Himmler, Hermann Göring sent a telegram from Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian Alps, where he had taken refuge. The telegram was addressed to Hitler, and it said in essence the following: given that Hitler was isolated in Berlin and apparently incapacitated to govern, Göring assumed that the 1941 decree designating him as Hitler's successor was now in effect. Therefore, if he did not receive a response by 10 p.m., he would consider that Hitler agreed and would assume leadership of the Reich. Göring believed he was acting in good faith. He believed that Hitler, trapped in the bunker with the Soviets just a few blocks away, could no longer govern. He believed that as the designated heir, he had a legal and moral obligation to take command. He even drafted the telegram in a respectful, almost supplicating tone. But Bormann saw his opportunity. Bormann hated Göring. He had been working for years to undermine his position, to get between him and Hitler, to present him as an incompetent and a potential traitor. And now, Göring's telegram gave him the perfect excuse. Bormann presented the telegram to Hitler as an ultimatum, as an act of treason, as an attempt to usurp power, and Hitler, already in a mental state on the verge of collapse, reacted exactly as Bormann expected. He ordered Göring's immediate dismissal from all his posts. He ordered his expulsion from the party, and he ordered his arrest. SS troops in Berchtesgaden surrounded Göring's residence, the Obersalzberg, and placed him under house arrest. Göring, who had been the second most powerful man in the Third Reich for more than a decade, suddenly found himself a prisoner of his own regime. Was Göring really a traitor, or was he a victim of Bormann's manipulation and Hitler's paranoia? The answer probably lies somewhere in between. Göring did not intend to betray Hitler, but he did intend to replace him, and in Hitler's mind, that was the same thing. What is clear is that Bormann acted with calculated malice. He knew exactly how to present the telegram to provoke the most extreme possible reaction in Hitler, and he succeeded. With Göring eliminated from the succession, Bormann further consolidated his position as the most influential man in the bunker, although that influence no longer meant much, given that the bunker was about to become a tomb. And here we come to the last days, the very last days, the days when the world collapsed on the heads of those who remained in the bunker, and each one had to decide how he wanted to die, or how he wanted to try to survive. The Führer bunker, the last redoubt of the Third Reich, a subterranean complex of narrow rooms, claustrophobic corridors, fluorescent lights, and recycled air, located under the gardens of the Reich Chancellery in the centre of Berlin. Here, several metres underground, protected by concrete walls more than 3 metres thick, Hitler spent the last weeks of his life, surrounded by a handful of collaborators, SS guards, secretaries, cooks, and a handful of generals who no longer had armies to command. What was life like in the bunker during those last days? The testimonies of the survivors paint a surreal picture. Above, Berlin was being destroyed, block by the Red Army. The fighting had reached the city centre. The roar of the Soviet artillery was constant, making the bunker walls vibrate. Below, a group of people lived in a parallel reality. Briefings were held where counter-offensives with divisions that no longer existed were discussed. Meals were served on porcelain dinnerware. Officers toasted with champagne while the ceiling trembled. And Hitler, ever more deteriorated, ever more disconnected, gave orders that no one would obey. Traudl Juncker, one of Hitler's secretaries, described the atmosphere as unreal, like living in a sinking submarine. She said that people oscillated between moments of hysteria and moments of supernatural calm. Some drank to excess, others cried, others simply waited. One of the most dramatic episodes of those last days in the bunker occurred on April 22nd, 1945. That day, during the afternoon briefing, Hitler asked about the situation on the front. He was informed that the counter-offensive he had ordered SS Obergruppenführer Felix Steiner to carry out had not happened. The so-called Combat Group Steiner, an improvised formation to which Hitler had entrusted the mission of stopping the Soviet advance north of Berlin, simply did not exist in the form that Hitler believed. Steiner did not have enough troops, or tanks, or ammunition. He could not attack. He did not attack. When Hitler learned this, something broke inside him. Witnesses described what followed as a total collapse. Hitler began to scream, to insult his generals, to curse the army, to say that everyone had betrayed him, that he was surrounded by liars, cowards, incompetents, that the war was lost, that he would stay in Berlin, that he would die in Berlin, that he would not flee, that he would shoot himself. It was the first time Hitler openly admitted defeat to his entourage, and the effect was devastating. Some present cried, others remained silent, stunned, and others, immediately, began to plan their escape, because that is what they did. As soon as Hitler uttered those words, the last illusion vanished, and each of those remaining in the bunker had to face a brutal question. Do I stay and die, or do I try to flee and live? The reactions were as varied as they were revealing. Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, chose to stay, and not just to stay himself, but to bring his wife Magda and their 6 children, Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Heidrun, all with names starting with H in Hitler's honour, to the bunker to die together. Magda Goebbels' decision to bring her children to the bunker, knowing what awaited them, is one of the most chilling acts in the entire history of the Third Reich. When asked why she did it, she gave an answer that chilled the blood. She did not want her children to live in a world without National Socialism, that the world that would come after was not worth living in. The children were between 4 and 12 years old. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, the favourite architect, the man who was probably closer to Hitler than anyone else on a personal level, at least during the early years, visited the bunker for the last time on April 23rd. Speer had spent the last few weeks in an extraordinarily ambiguous position. On the one hand, he continued to visit Hitler, continued to express his loyalty, continued to be received as a friend. On the other hand, he had been systematically sabotaging the most destructive order Hitler had given in the entire war. That order is known as the Nero Decree. On March 19th, 1945, Hitler signed an order that established the destruction of all German infrastructure that could fall into enemy hands. Bridges, factories, power plants, water systems, railways, mines, food depots, everything. Hitler's logic was simple and terrifying. If Germany lost the war, it meant the German people had not been strong enough to survive, and therefore did not deserve to survive. The decree was literally a death sentence for the entire nation. Speer opposed it. Not openly, he was not that brave, but with subterfuge. He travelled throughout Germany convincing industrialists, generals, and local officials to ignore the order. He argued that the infrastructure would be necessary after the war, that destroying it would only cause unnecessary suffering, and in many cases, he succeeded. Many installations that Hitler had ordered to be destroyed were preserved thanks to Speer's intervention. Was this an act of heroic resistance, or was it simply the calculation of an intelligent man who knew the war was lost and wanted to position himself favourably for the trial that would inevitably come? Probably both. Speer was a master of ambiguity, and that ambiguity would save his life in Nuremberg, where he was sentenced to 20 years in prison, not to the gallows, in part because he convinced the judges that he had tried to sabotage Hitler's most destructive orders. But let's return to the bunker. What happened in those last hours? How did the most feared regime of the 20th century end? Let's go step by step, because each day of that last week brought a drama that would deserve its own movie. On April 25th, 1945, Soviet troops completed the encirclement of Berlin. The city was completely isolated. There was no escape by land. The airfields had been destroyed or captured. Only one partially open communication axis remained, the East-West Avenue, which Luftwaffe pilots used as an improvised landing strip, and which the Soviets constantly bombed. That same day, Soviet and American troops met in Torgau on the Elbe River. Germany was cut in two. The image of Soviet and American soldiers shaking hands over the Elbe went around the world. For the Allies, it was a moment of triumph. For the Germans trapped in Berlin, it was the confirmation that there would be no rescue. Hitler, however, kept talking about General Walter Wenck's army. The 12th Army of Wenck, an improvised formation composed largely of cadets, convalescents, and inexperienced soldiers, was the last hope Hitler had. He had ordered Wenck to march on Berlin and break the Soviet encirclement. On his maps, he moved the arrows representing Wenck's army, as if it were a powerful force capable of changing the fate of the battle. The reality was very different. Wenck had neither the strength nor the fuel to reach Berlin. He tried, but was stopped by Soviet forces at Fürth, about 30 kilometers from the city. The most he could do was open a corridor for some civilians and soldiers to escape to the west, towards the American lines. It was a noble gesture, but irrelevant to the fate of Berlin. And while Hitler waited for an army that would never arrive, the encirclement tightened. On April 26th, Soviet troops controlled more than half of Berlin. The fighting took place block by block, building by building, room by room. It was a fight of extraordinary brutality. The German defenders, a mix of regular soldiers, SS members, Volkssturm volunteers, teenagers from the Hitler Youth, and desperately armed civilians, fought with the energy of those who know they have nothing to lose. The Soviets, after 4 years of a war that had cost the Soviet Union more than 20 million lives, advanced with relentless determination and, in many cases, with a thirst for revenge that translated into terrible atrocities against the civilian population. The figures are staggering. It is estimated that between 80,000 and 100,000 Soviet soldiers and a similar number of German defenders died during the Battle of Berlin. Civilian casualties are counted in the tens of thousands, and the crimes committed against the women of Berlin by Soviet troops constituted one of the greatest tragedies of the post-war period. It is estimated that between 100,000 and more than 1 million women were raped during the fall of Berlin and the subsequent weeks. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere had become unbreathable, not just metaphorically, but literally. The ventilation system barely worked. The smell of sweat, food, and diesel fuel from the generators mixed with the humidity and the dust that came off the walls every time a Soviet shell hit nearby. The lights flickered, the ground trembled. The occupants of the bunker lived in a state of permanent exhaustion. They slept little, they ate what was available, they drank a lot. Alcohol flowed freely in those last hours. Bolt, the young officer who left one of the most detailed testimonies of those days, described scenes of collective drunkenness among the remaining officers and officials. Men who knew they were going to die drinking champagne and liquors that had been stored in the chancellery. And in the midst of that chaos, of that desperation, Hitler made two decisions that surprised everyone. The first, to marry Eva Braun. The second, to dictate his political and personal testament. Both things happened in the early morning of April 29th, 1945. The wedding was a brief ceremony, almost absurd in its bureaucratic normality. A Berlin municipal official named Walter Wagner was brought to the bunker to officiate the civil ceremony. Hitler and Eva Braun signed the papers. The witnesses were Goebbels and Bormann. Eva, upon signing, began to write her maiden name Braun, before correcting herself and writing Hitler. A trivial, human, almost tender detail in the midst of absolute horror. After the ceremony, there was a small celebration. Champagne was served, toasts were made, there was conversation. All very proper, very formal, while a few blocks away Soviet tanks were reducing Berlin to dust. But what is truly revealing about those last hours is Hitler's political testament, because in that document, dictated to his secretary Traudl Junge in the early morning of April 29th, as explosions shook the bunker's ceiling, Hitler laid bare the true nature of his mind. The testament contains no reflection, no regret, no doubt. There is not a single mention of the suffering his decisions had caused to tens of millions of people. Instead, the document is full of justifications, accusations, and above all, hatred. Hitler blames the war on international Jews and their agents. He claims that he never wanted the war, that it was the others who provoked it, that Germany was the victim, not the perpetrator. And then he names his successors. This is the moment where the betrayals reach their climax, because in his testament, Hitler formally expels Göring and Himmler from the party and from all their posts. He accuses them of treason, of disloyalty, of having caused immeasurable damage to the country by trying to negotiate with the enemy without his permission. And who does he name as his successor? Not Goebbels, who was the most obvious candidate. Not Bormann, who controlled access to him. He names Admiral Karl Dönitz as the new president of the Reich and supreme commander of the armed forces. Why Dönitz? Who was this man, and why did Hitler choose him to inherit the rubble of his empire? Karl Dönitz was the commander of the Kriegsmarine, the German war navy. He was a professional military man, respected by his troops, relatively distant from the political intrigues of Berlin. He had directed the U-boat campaign in the Atlantic with considerable skill, and most importantly for Hitler at that moment, he had not betrayed him. He had not tried to negotiate with the enemy. He had not tried to usurp power. He was, simply, the last man standing who still seemed loyal. But was Dönitz's loyalty genuine, or was it simply the result of being geographically distant from the bunker's intrigues? That is a question historians continue to debate. What is clear is that Dönitz, once informed of his appointment, acted with pragmatism. He tried to buy time by negotiating partial surrenders with the Western Allies, trying to get as many German soldiers and civilians as possible to surrender to the Americans and the British instead of falling into Soviet hands. He partially succeeded, but the unconditional surrender, signed on May 8, 1945, in Reims and ratified in Berlin-Karlshorst on the night of May 8th to 9th, put an end to everything. But let's go back to the bunker, because we haven't reached the end yet. April 30th, 1945. Hitler got up late, as was his custom. He had lunch with his secretaries and with Eva Braun, now Eva Hitler. It was a silent lunch. He spoke little. According to Traudl Junge, he seemed calm, resigned, as if he had already made the decision and was at peace with it. After lunch, Hitler said goodbye to his staff. He shook hands. He said a few words to each of them. He gave cyanide capsules to some. Eva Braun hugged several women in the bunker. There were tears. And then Hitler and Eva retired to their private quarters. They closed the door. What happened next has been reconstructed from the testimonies of those who were outside the room. A shot was heard. Some say there were two. Hitler's adjutant, Otto Günscher, and his valet, Heinz Linder, opened the door. Hitler was on the sofa with a bullet hole in his right temple. Beside him, Eva Braun was dead from cyanide poisoning. The room smelled of bitter almonds, the characteristic smell of hydrocyanic acid and gunpowder. The bodies were taken out to the Chancellery garden, placed in a bomb crater, doused with gasoline, about 200 litres, according to some estimates, and burned. The flames burned for hours, but they did not completely consume the remains. The Soviets would find the fragments days later. Hitler was dead, but the bunker was still alive. And what happened there in the following hours was, if anything, even more horrible. Goebbels briefly assumed the office of Chancellor of the Reich, as Hitler had stipulated in his testament. His first and last official action was to try to negotiate with the Soviets. He sent General Hans Krebs, who spoke Russian, to the Soviet lines with a ceasefire proposal. The Soviets demanded unconditional surrender. Goebbels rejected the condition. And then he did what he had planned from the beginning. On the afternoon of May 1st, 1945, Joseph and Magda Goebbels poisoned their 6 children with cyanide. The children were asleep. They had been given a sedative beforehand. Magda inserted the capsules into their mouths and squeezed their jaws to break them. Then Joseph and Magda went up to the Chancellery garden. An SS adjutant shot them both. Their bodies were doused with gasoline and set on fire, although the cremation was partial. It is difficult to find words to describe the horror of that act. 6 children, innocents, murdered by their own parents in the name of an ideology that no longer even existed. It is one of the darkest moments in the entire history of the 20th century. But what happened to the others? What became of the rest of the bunker's occupants? Most tried to flee. On the night of May 1st to 2nd, those remaining in the bunker organised a mass breakout. They divided into several groups and tried to break through the Soviet lines to the north or west. Some used the Berlin subway tunnels. Others slipped through the devastated streets, blending in with the civilians. Bormann, Hitler's secretary, the man who for years had been the great eminence of the regime, tried to escape with one of these groups. He was last seen on the night of May 1st to 2nd, near the Weidendammer Bridge. For decades, his fate was a mystery. It was rumoured that he had escaped to South America, like so many other Nazis. But in 1972, during construction work in Berlin, human remains were found near Lehrtes station. In 1998, a DNA analysis confirmed that the remains were Bormann's. He had died during the escape, probably by biting a cyanide capsule when he was trapped by the Soviets. Others had different fates. General Krebs committed suicide in the bunker on May 1st. General Wilhelm Bergdorf did the same. Hitler's personal pilot, Hans Bauer, tried to flee and was seriously injured, losing a leg. He was captured by the Soviets and spent 10 years in a prison camp. Traudl Junge, Hitler's secretary, managed to escape the bunker and cross the Soviet lines. She was briefly captured, but later released. She lived the rest of her life tormented by the guilt of having served Hitler. She died in 2002, and her testimony, published as a book and adapted for the screen, became one of the most valuable sources on the last days of the bunker. And then there were the hierarchs who were not in the bunker. Those who had fled before or who had never been there. Those who tried to disappear, to reinvent themselves, to escape. Himmler, the great traitor, wandered for weeks through northern Germany, disguised with an eye patch and false documents in the name of a police sergeant. On May 23, 1945, he was detained by British soldiers at a checkpoint near Lüneburg. At first, he was not recognised, but when they took him to an interrogation centre and asked him to identify himself, Himmler removed the patch and said, "I am Heinrich Himmler." The British were stunned. They called a doctor to examine him. When the doctor tried to check Himmler's mouth, a standard procedure to look for hidden poison capsules, Himmler bit down on a cyanide capsule and fell dead in minutes. The architect of the Holocaust, the man who had supervised the murder of millions, died on the floor of a British military hut, writhing as the poison devoured his insides. There was no trial, there was no formal justice, just a corpse in a pool of cyanide. Was this a final act of cowardice, or was it the last gesture of control from a man who refused to be judged by others? Historians debate. What is indisputable is that Himmler eluded the punishment he deserved, and that his death deprived the world of a trial that would have been one of the most revealing in history. Goering had a different fate, liberated by American troops. When the SS guarding him in Berchtesgaden fled before the Allied advance, Goering surrendered to the Americans with the expectation of being treated as a head of state. He presented himself in his best uniforms, his medals, his marshal's baton, and an attitude that fluctuated between joviality and arrogance. The American soldiers, fascinated and horrified in equal measure, photographed him extensively. Goering seemed to enjoy the attention, but reality soon set in. Goering was tried in Nuremberg as a war criminal. He was found guilty on all charges: conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to death by hanging. But the night before the execution, on October 15th, 1946, Goering committed suicide with a cyanide capsule he had managed to hide throughout the trial. How he got the poison remains a mystery. Bormann, as we have said, died in the ruins of Berlin. He was tried in absentia at Nuremberg and sentenced to death, although his body would not be found until decades later. Ribbentrop, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, was captured in Hamburg in June 1945. He was tried at Nuremberg, sentenced to death, and hanged on October 16th, 1946. They were the first executions. Keitel, the chief of the OKW, was captured, tried, condemned, and hanged at Nuremberg. His last words were, "I ask Almighty God to have mercy on the German people." Jodl, chief of operations of the OKW, was also hanged. Years later, a German court posthumously rehabilitated him, only for the decision to be annulled. Speer, as we have mentioned, was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He served his sentence in Spandau prison, in Berlin, where he wrote his memoirs, a fascinating, brilliantly written, and profoundly manipulative book in its attempt to present Speer as an innocent technocrat who didn't know what was happening. He was released in 1966 and died in 1981. And then there were those who escaped, those who disappeared, those who faded into the shadows. Adolf Eichmann, the logistical organizer of the Holocaust, fled to Argentina with false documents provided by the Odessa Network, a clandestine organization of ex-Nazis. He lived in Buenos Aires for years under the name of Ricardo Clement, working in a Mercedes-Benz factory. He was kidnapped by Israeli Mossad agents in 1960 and taken to Jerusalem, where he was tried, sentenced to death, and hanged in 1962. His trial was televised and had an enormous impact on the world's consciousness about the Holocaust. Josef Mengele, the angel of death of Auschwitz, also fled to South America. He lived in Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil for decades, always one step ahead of the Nazi hunters. He died by drowning while swimming at a Brazilian beach in 1979. His body was exhumed in 1985 and his identity confirmed by forensic analysis. He was never tried. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, responsible for the deportation and torture of thousands of people in France, fled to Bolivia with the help of US intelligence services, who used him as an anti-communist agent during the Cold War. He was extradited to France in 1983 and sentenced to life in prison. He died in prison in 1991. The list goes on and on. Franz Stangl, commandant of the Treblinka extermination camp, lived quietly in Brazil until he was located by Simon Wiesenthal. Alois Brunner, Eichmann's right-hand man, took refuge in Syria, where he lived protected by the government until his death, probably in the early 2000s. Walter Ruff, inventor of the mobile gas vans that murdered tens of thousands of people, lived comfortably in Chile until his death in 1984. Each of these names is a story of horror, of impunity, of tardy or non-existent justice, and each of them represents a collective failure of humanity to ensure that those responsible for the greatest crime in history were held accountable. But let's pause for a moment, because in the midst of all this darkness, all this brutality, all this betrayal, there are stories that deserve to be told for a different reason. Stories of people who, in the most terrible moments, chose humanity over hatred. People who risked everything, their career, their freedom, their lives, to do the right thing. We have already spoken of Stauffenberg and the July 20th conspirators, but there were many others. There was Oskar Schindler, the German entrepreneur who saved more than 1,000 Jews by employing them in his factories, protecting them from deportation to the extermination camps. Schindler was not a saint. He was a womanizer, a drinker, an opportunist, who initially approached the Nazi Party for economic convenience. But something changed in him when he witnessed the brutality of the Krakow ghetto. And from that moment on, he dedicated his fortune and risked his life to save as many as he could. There was Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat who in Budapest, in 1944, issued thousands of Swedish protection passports to Hungarian Jews, saving them from deportation to Auschwitz. Wallenberg negotiated directly with Adolf Eichmann, confronted the SS death squads, and managed to protect tens of thousands of people. When the Red Army entered Budapest in January 1945, Wallenberg disappeared. He was arrested by the Soviets and was never heard from again with certainty. It is believed he died in a Soviet prison in 1947, although the exact circumstances remain a mystery. There was Georg Ferdinand Duckwitz, a German diplomat stationed in Denmark who, in September 1943, leaked to the Danish leaders the information that the Nazis planned to deport the Danish Jews. Thanks to that warning, the Danish population organised an extraordinary rescue operation in just a few days. More than 7,000 Jews were secretly transported across the strait to Sweden, which took them in. It was one of the most successful rescue operations of the entire war. And there were the thousands of anonymous people in Germany, in the occupied countries, in the concentration camps, who performed small acts of resistance, of compassion, of humanity. The guard who looked the other way, the neighbour who hid a family, the prisoner who shared his ration of bread. These acts, individually small, collectively immense, are proof that even in the most extreme circumstances, humanity is capable of resisting. But why is it important to remember all this? Why 80 years after the end of the war, are we still talking about the betrayals in Hitler's circle, the intrigues of the bunker, the crimes of the Third Reich? Because history is not just a tale of the past, it is a warning for the future. The mechanisms that brought Nazism to power, the manipulation of fear, the demonization of the other, the gradual erosion of democratic institutions, the complicity of the elites, the passivity of the majority, are not exclusive to 1930s Germany. They are permanent temptations of the human condition. They can arise in any society, in any era, if the conditions are right, and if there are not enough people willing to resist. And the betrayals within Hitler's circle teach us something more, that regimes built on fear, lies, and blind loyalty carry within them the seed of their own destruction. Because when loyalty is based on fear and not conviction, It crumbles the moment fear changes direction. When the Nazi hierarch stopped fearing Hitler and started fearing the Allies, their loyalty evaporated like water on a hot plate. Himmler, Goering, Speer, all of them demonstrated that the unbreakable loyalty they swore was nothing more than a mask that concealed the most vulgar instinct of survival. Hitler knew it. In a way, he always knew it. His paranoia was not irrational. It was the reflection of a man who had built his power on distrust and who, therefore, knew he could not trust anyone. "Everyone lies to me," he said in one of his last meetings in the bunker. And he was right. Everyone lied to him. Everyone betrayed him. But it was he who had created the system that made lies and betrayal inevitable. Now then, there is an aspect of this story that we have not yet explored in depth, and that deserves special attention, because the betrayals within Hitler's circle were not limited to the generals, ministers, and hierarchs we have mentioned. There was another form of betrayal, more silent, more subtle, but perhaps more significant in the long run. The betrayal of information. One of the best-kept secrets of the Second World War was Operation Ultra, the British program for deciphering the Enigma codes used by the German armed forces. Since 1940, the cryptographers at Bletchley Park, led by the mathematical genius Alan Turing, had managed to decipher a large part of the secret German communications. This meant that the Allies could read the messages between Hitler and his generals, know the battle plans before they were executed, and anticipate the enemy's movements. But how was it possible that the Germans did not realize that their codes were compromised? In part because the Enigma machine was genuinely sophisticated and the Germans trusted in its invulnerability. In part because the Allies were extraordinarily careful in how they used the information obtained, avoiding actions that could reveal they were reading enemy messages. And in part because within the German intelligence apparatus itself, there were people who suspected the compromise of Enigma, but did not dare to report it, or whose warnings were ignored. Canaris, the chief of the Abwehr, is a particularly interesting case. There is evidence that Canaris knew, or at least strongly suspected, that German communications were being intercepted, and it is possible that he did nothing about it precisely because he wanted the Allies to have that advantage. It would be consistent with his general behaviour as a saboteur of the regime from within. But there is no conclusive evidence, and Canaris himself took his secrets to the grave. Canaris was arrested after July 20th, 1944, when the Gestapo investigation uncovered his connections with the conspirators. He was sent to the Flossenburg concentration camp. On April 9th, 1945, just a month before the end of the war, he was hanged along with Hans Oster and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the Lutheran theologian, who had also participated in the resistance. The execution of Canaris was another act of late and futile revenge by a regime that was already dead. At that point, the war was lost. Killing Canaris changed nothing militarily, but for Himmler, who ordered the execution, it was a matter of principle, or perhaps of fear. Because if Canaris survived the war, he could testify about what he knew, about the secret operations of the Abwehr, about the connections between German intelligence and the Allies, about Himmler's own attempts to negotiate with the enemy. The irony is brutal. Himmler ordered the execution of Canaris for treason, and just weeks later, he himself would commit an even greater treason. But there is another story of informational betrayal that deserves to be told because it illustrates the moral complexity of these times as few others do. The story of Admiral Canaris and Reinhard Heydrich. Heydrich, head of the Reich Security Main Office, RSHA, and later Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia, was probably the most dangerous man in the Third Reich after Hitler. Cold, intelligent, ambitious, ruthless. He was Canaris' main rival and, at the same time, his neighbour. Literally. In Berlin, Canaris and Heydrich lived on the same street. Their families knew each other. Their wives played croquet together. And while they publicly maintained a relationship of forced civility, in private they waged a ruthless war. Heydrich suspected Canaris. He knew, or sensed, that the chief of the Abwehr was not loyal to the regime, and he spent years trying to find proof. Canaris, for his part, knew that Heydrich was watching him, and he walked a tightrope every day of his life. The assassination of Heydrich in June 1942, executed by Czech commandos trained by the British in Operation Anthropoid, eliminated the man who had come closest to discovering Canaris's double life. If Heydrich had lived, it is likely that Canaris would have been discovered much earlier, and with him, the entire resistance network within the Abwehr. How many lives did Heydrich's death save? Indirectly. It's impossible to calculate, but the chain of cause and effect is fascinating. A group of Czech commandos kills a Nazi officer in Prague. That allows a German spy who is secretly working against his own government to continue operating for 2 more years. During those 2 years, that spy provides crucial information to the Allies, sabotages Nazi operations, and protects conspirators, who will eventually try to assassinate Hitler. History is full of these hidden connections, of these invisible threads that unite seemingly unrelated events. And the betrayals within Hitler's circle are a perfect example of how individual actions, even the smallest, most hidden ones, can have enormous consequences. But let's return to the final days, because there is a final chapter that we have not yet told, and it is perhaps the most revealing of all. What did ordinary Germans feel when it all ended? Not the hierarchs, not the generals, not the SS officers, the normal Germans, those who lived in the bombed-out cities, those who had lost their sons on the front, those who had believed, or pretended to believe, in the promises of the regime. When Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 1945, the news was not immediately disseminated. German radio announced his death on May 1st, but in a misleading way. It said that Hitler had fallen in combat, defending Berlin, like a hero. One last lie for a regime built on lies. The unconditional surrender, signed first in Reims on May 7th and ratified in Berlin on the night of May 8th, brought the war in Europe to a final close. For the Allies, it was a day of celebration. In London, Paris, New York, Moscow, people took to the streets to celebrate. There were parades, toasts, hugs between strangers. For the Germans, May 8th was something very different. It was the day of total defeat, of absolute humiliation, of foreign occupation. The cities were in ruins. Millions of people were refugees in their own country. The economy had collapsed. There was no food, no work, no visible future. And then came the knowledge of what the regime they had supported or tolerated had done in their name. When the Allies liberated the concentration and extermination camps, they forced the local populations to visit the camps, to see the piles of corpses, the gas chambers, the crematoria. The photographs of these visits are extraordinary. Lines of well-dressed German citizens, walking among piles of skeletal bodies, with expressions that oscillated between horror, disbelief, and shame. Did they know? Did ordinary Germans know what was happening in the camps? This is perhaps the most difficult question in the entire history of the Third Reich, and the answer, like almost everything in this story, is complex. Many Germans knew that the Jews were being deported. They saw it with their own eyes, the trains, the convoys, the empty houses. They knew that the deportees did not return. They knew something terrible was happening, but most did not know the specific details, the gas chambers, the mass shootings, the industrialized extermination, or at least that's what they said afterward. Others did know. The soldiers who had served in the East had seen things. The railway workers who transported the deportation trains knew what they were carrying. The neighbours of Dachau, of Birkenwald, of Bergen-Belsen, who lived a few kilometres from the camps, smelled the smoke from the crematoria. How many knew? How many suspected? How many preferred not to know? The philosopher Hannah Arendt, who covered the Eichmann trial for The New Yorker, coined an expression that has become one of the most quoted of the 20th century, the banality of evil. With it, she described the capacity of common, ordinary people, not monstrous in appearance, to participate in acts of extraordinary evil simply by following orders, carrying out procedures, doing their job. Eichmann was not a demon, he was a bureaucrat, an efficient organizer, a man who sat at a desk and moved papers that meant the death of millions. And that is, perhaps, the most terrifying lesson of all those left to us by the last days of the Third Reich. It is not that monsters exist, that we already knew. It is that monsters often have the appearance of normal people, that absolute evil can be executed with bureaucratic efficiency, that the most profound betrayal is not that of a general who secretly negotiates with the enemy, but that of an entire society that allows horror to take root under its gaze and decides to look the other way. And that is also the reason why these stories must continue to be told, not to gloat in the horror, not to point the finger at the culprits of 80 years ago, but to remember what can happen when fear replaces reason, when blind obedience replaces moral judgment, when loyalty to the leader replaces loyalty to humanity. The last days of the Third Reich were days of betrayal, but the greatest betrayal was not that of Himmler, nor of Goering, nor of any general with a name and surname. The greatest betrayal was that of the regime itself against its people, a regime that promised greatness and delivered destruction, that promised security and sowed terror, that promised 1,000 years of glory and did not last 13, that, in its final hours, when all was lost, when there was nothing left to save, ordered the destruction of the infrastructure that kept its own Germans alive, because its leader had decided that if he fell, the entire nation must fall with him. That was the definitive betrayal, and its victims were not the hierarchs who committed suicide in bunkers or fled to South America. Its victims were the millions of common people who paid the price for the ambition, the madness, and the cruelty of a few. Now, before closing this first part, there is something we have not yet explored, something that historians have begun to unravel in more detail in recent decades, and that sheds a completely new light on the dynamics of betrayals within the Third Reich. It is about the secret negotiations of the SS in Italy, the intrigues of Karl Wolff, and the early surrender of the German forces in the Italian theatre, which occurred days before the general capitulation. Who was Karl Wolff? Why were his actions considered a betrayal by some and an act of sanity by others? And what role did American espionage, specifically Allen Dulles and the OSS, play in this secret operation known as Operation Sunrise? The story of Operation Sunrise is, in many ways, the counterpart to Himmler's failed negotiations. Where Himmler failed because his offer was flatly rejected, Wolff achieved something extraordinary. He negotiated the surrender of nearly 1 million German soldiers in Italy, potentially saving hundreds of thousands of lives, and doing so behind the backs of both Hitler and, in a sense, Himmler. Karl Wolff was the SS Obergruppenführer and police general in charge of the SS and police forces in Italy. He was an elegant, cultured man, with a natural knack for diplomacy that contrasted with the usual brutality of the SS. He had been Himmler's personal adjutant for years, his right-hand man, his liaison to Hitler. But by late 1944, Wolff had reached the same conclusion as many others. The war was lost, and the sooner it ended, the better. Through Swiss and Italian intermediaries, Wolff established contact with Allen Dulles, the head of the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, precursor to the CIA, stationed in Bern, Switzerland. The negotiations were extraordinarily delicate. If Hitler found out, Wolff would be executed. If the Soviets found out, they could accuse the Western Allies of negotiating a separate peace, breaking the alliance. And in fact, when Stalin was informed, because he was informed, despite efforts to keep it secret, his reaction was furious. He accused the Allies of negotiating behind his back and sent a letter of reproach to Roosevelt, that contributed to increasing the tensions that would eventually lead to the Cold War. But Wolf persisted, and on April 29th, 1945, the same day Hitler was dictating his testament in the Berlin bunker, the German forces in Italy signed a surrender agreement that would take effect on May 2nd. It was the first massive surrender of German troops in the war, days before the general capitulation. How many lives did Operation Sunrise save? It is impossible to determine exactly, but historians estimate that by avoiding additional weeks of combat in northern Italy, a mountainous region where the fighting would have been particularly bloody, the early surrender saved tens of thousands of lives, both Allied and German. And yet, Wolf was a war criminal. He had participated in the deportation of Italian Jews. He had been one of Himmler's closest men during the years of the Holocaust. His motivation for negotiating the surrender was not humanitarian. It was his own survival. He wanted to position himself favourably for the post-war period, to present himself as a reasonable man who had worked for peace. And he succeeded, at least partially. After the war, Wolf was treated with remarkable leniency. He testified at Nuremberg as a witness, not as an accused. He was not tried for war crimes until 1964, when a German court sentenced him to 15 years in prison. He served only part of the sentence and was released in 1971. He died in 1984, a free man. The story of Karl Wolf raises uncomfortable questions. Can an objectively good act, saving thousands of lives, redeem a trajectory of complicity with evil? Do motivations matter when the outcome is positive? Is pragmatism more valid than morality in times of war? There are no easy answers, and perhaps that is precisely the lesson. Because what all these stories of betrayal have in common, from Hess to Himmler, from Stauffenberg to Wolf, from Canaris to Göring, is that they were the product of a system that corrupted everything it touched. A system where loyalty was not a value but a tool, where truth was not a goal but an obstacle, where power was not a means but an end in itself. And when that system collapsed, when the bombs rained down, when the armies disintegrated, when death was at the door, each of those men revealed their true nature. Some chose courage, others chose cowardice. Some chose humanity, others chose cruelty to the end. But all, without exception, were devoured by the machinery they themselves had helped to build. That was the final destiny of the traitors of Hitler's circle. Not death, not prison, not escape, but the revelation that they had dedicated their lives to serving a cause that did not deserve their service, and that when they tried to save themselves from the consequences, they discovered it was already too late. The Third Reich lasted 12 years and 4 months, a sigh in the history of humanity. But in that brief span, it destroyed nations, murdered millions, and left scars that have not yet healed. And the betrayals within Hitler's circle, far from being mere anecdotes, are the mirror in which the true nature of the regime is reflected. A regime that presented itself as a monolith of loyalty and discipline, but which inside was rotten with rivalries, lies, and cowardice. A regime that preached sacrifice for the fatherland, while its leaders desperately sought how to save their own skins. A regime that, in the end, was defeated not only by the armies that surrounded it, but by the betrayal of its own men. What would have happened if the July 20th plot had succeeded? How many lives would have been saved if Stauffenberg had managed to kill Hitler 9 months before the end of the war? Would the Holocaust have ended sooner? Would the destruction of Dresden, Berlin, Warsaw have been avoided? Would the millions of soldiers and civilians who died in the last months of the conflict have been saved? But first, there's something I need you to do. Give this video a like. Share it. Because these stories deserve to be known, and subscribe if you haven't already, because what's coming in the second part will leave you speechless. Now let's continue, because there is a name that we have not yet explored with the depth it deserves. A name that, in many ways, represents the strangest, most twisted, and most difficult to classify betrayal of the entire Third Reich. Albert Speer. We already mentioned him briefly when we talked about the Nero Decree, that insane order from Hitler to destroy all of Germany's infrastructure. We said that Speer sabotaged it, that he convinced industrialists and generals to ignore it, that his intervention saved factories, bridges, and power plants that would be vital for the survival of millions of Germans in the post-war period. All of that is true, but Speer's story is infinitely more complex and more disturbing. Because Speer was not a dissident, he was not a resistor, he was not a man who opposed Nazism from the beginning, like Canaris or Stauffenberg. Speer was, for more than a decade, one of the pillars of the regime. He was the architect who designed the monumental settings for the party congresses in Nuremberg, those cathedrals of light and granite that turned Nazi rallies into quasi-religious spectacles. He was the man Hitler chose to redesign Berlin as Germania, the capital of the world, with avenues 300 meters wide and a domed building capable of holding 180,000 people. He was, from 1942, the armaments minister, who multiplied German war production using millions of forced labourers and slaves from the concentration camps. Speer knew. He knew what was happening in the camps. He knew where the workers he used in his factories came from. He knew they were dying by the thousands, from hunger, from exhaustion, from brutality. And if at any point he had doubts, he dispelled them by personally visiting facilities where the suffering was evident, palpable, impossible to ignore. And yet, after the war, Speer built an extraordinary myth. The myth that he didn't know. That he was so absorbed in his technical responsibilities that he did not learn of the horrors of the Holocaust. That he was an apolitical technocrat, an artist trapped in the machinery of power. A man who simply did his job without asking too many questions. The judges at Nuremberg, incredibly, believed him, at least partially. Speer was the only defendant who expressed remorse, who accepted moral, though not legal, responsibility for the regime's crimes, and that strategy saved his life. While Ribbentrop, Keitel, Jodl, and others were sentenced to the gallows, Speer received 20 years in prison. But was his remorse sincere, or was it the most brilliant performance of a man who had always been, above all, a master of manipulation? This question has fascinated historians for decades, and the evidence suggests that the truth lies somewhere in between, like almost everything in Speer's story. On the one hand, it is true that Speer sabotaged the Nero Decree. It is true that, in the last months of the war, he disobeyed direct orders from Hitler to preserve what remained of the German infrastructure. And it is true that, on at least one occasion, he seriously considered assassinating Hitler. This is a story that Speer himself told in his memoirs, and which has been the subject of intense debate. According to Speer, in early 1945, he conceived a plan to introduce poison gas, tabun, a nerve agent, into the ventilation system of Hitler's bunker. The idea was to kill Hitler, Bormann, Goebbels, and all who remained in the bunker in a single blow. But the plan failed, according to Speer, because Hitler had ordered that the bunker's air intake be raised several meters, with a tall chimney that made it impossible to introduce the gas from ground level. Is this story true? Many historians consider it, at a minimum, exaggerated. Some believe that Speer invented or embellished the episode after the war to reinforce his image as a covert dissident. Others think that the plan really existed, but that Speer did not have the courage to carry it out. What is clear is that Speer never tried to assassinate Hitler. He thought about it, he talked about it, but he didn't do it. And this is, perhaps, the essence of Albert Speer, a man who was always one step away from doing the right thing, but who never took that step. A man who knew how to distinguish right from wrong, but who repeatedly chose convenience over morality. A man who, in the end, betrayed Hitler, not out of principle but out of pragmatism, and who then betrayed the truth by constructing a version of himself that was much nobler than reality justified. Speer served his 20 years in Spandau prison in West Berlin. He was released in 1966, and lived until 1981, publishing memoirs that became bestsellers and giving interviews in which he continued to polish his image as the good Nazi. He died in London during a trip to participate in a BBC programme. He collapsed in a hotel, alone. But what about the others? What about those whose betrayals were not as publicised, but had equally dramatic consequences? There is a story that deserves to be told now, because it connects directly with the central theme of this video, the disintegration of loyalty within the Third Reich. The story of General Helmut Weidlin and the final defence of Berlin. Weidlin was the commander of the 56th Panzer Corps, one of the last armoured formations remaining in the Berlin sector when the Soviets closed the encirclement. On April 23, 1945, in the midst of the battle's chaos, Hitler learned that Weidlin's troops had withdrawn from their positions without authorization. Furious, he ordered his arrest and execution. But Weidlin, upon learning of the order, did not flee. He did something extraordinary. He presented himself personally in Hitler's bunker to explain himself. He directly confronted the dictator, laid out the real situation of his troops, without fuel, without ammunition, surrounded, and explained that the withdrawal had not been a betrayal, but a tactical necessity to avoid total annihilation. Hitler listened to him, and in one of those absurd twists that characterized his last days, he not only pardoned Weidlin, but also appointed him commander of the defense of Berlin. From a death sentence to the highest military responsibility post in the capital of the Reich, in a matter of hours, Weidlin accepted the post knowing it was an impossible mission. Berlin could not be defended. The Soviets had a crushing superiority in men, tanks, artillery, and aviation. The German defenders were a heterogeneous mix of regular soldiers, members of the SS, Volkssturm, the popular militia composed of the elderly and adolescents and Hitler youth, many of them boys of 14 and 15, who barely knew how to hold a rifle. Weidlin did what he could. He organised the defences, distributed the scarce resources, tried to coordinate movements amidst destroyed communications and broken chains of command, but he knew it was all futile. Each day that passed meant more deaths, more civilians trapped in the crossfire, more children sent to die against tanks. And then, Weidlin made a decision that separates him from many other generals of those last days. When Hitler committed suicide on April 30th and the chain of command disintegrated, Weidlin did not flee. He did not commit suicide. He did not try to prolong the resistance uselessly. On the morning of May 2nd, 1945, Weidlin crossed the lines and formally surrendered to the Soviet General Vasily Chuikov, commander of the 8th Guards Army, and he issued an order to all remaining German troops in Berlin, cease resistance. That order saved thousands of lives, perhaps tens of thousands, because each additional hour of combat meant more deaths on both sides and more suffering for the trapped civilians. Was Weidlin a traitor? The regime's fanatics would say yes, that he should have fought to the last man, as Hitler had ordered. But the soldiers and civilians who survived, thanks to his decision, would probably have a different opinion. Weidlin was captured by the Soviets and sent to a prisoner of war camp in the Soviet Union. He died in captivity in 1955, 10 years after the end of the war. He never returned to Germany. His story is a reminder that even in the most desperate moments, individual decisions matter. A man who decides to surrender instead of continuing to fight. A general who chooses to save lives instead of following suicidal orders. These acts, invisible in the grand headlines of history, are what mark the difference between total tragedy and mitigated tragedy. But let's leave Weidlin and return to another question that has been floating since the beginning of this video, and that we have not yet fully answered. What role did Allied intelligence services play in fomenting, exploiting, or even provoking the betrayals within the Third Reich? Because the Allies were not mere spectators, they were actors, and their influence on the dynamics of betrayals and conspiracies within the Nazi regime was much greater than is generally recognised. We already talked about Operation Ultra and the decryption of Enigma, but there was much more. The British SOE, Special Operations Executive, the organisation created by Churchill with the mandate to set Europe on fire, carried out hundreds of sabotage, subversion, and psychological warfare operations in occupied Europe. SOE agents were infiltrated in France, Norway, the Netherlands, Yugoslavia, Greece, and other countries where they organised resistance networks, destroyed enemy infrastructure, and sowed chaos behind German lines. But the SOE also tried, with less success, to penetrate Germany itself. The problem was that Germany, unlike the occupied countries, did not have a population willing to collaborate massively with foreign agents. The Gestapo's surveillance was extreme, and the fear of reprisals was paralysing. However, there were exceptions, and one of the most fascinating involves the resistance circle around Canaris's Abwehr. The most important contact between the German resistance and the Allies was a series of communications that occurred through diplomatic channels in neutral countries: Switzerland, Sweden, the Vatican, Turkey. German diplomats and agents who sympathised with the resistance met secretly with Allied representatives to transmit information, sound out positions, and in some cases, try to negotiate the conditions of a possible peace. One of these channels involved Alan Dulles, the same man who would later negotiate Operation Sunrise with Karl Wolff. Dulles, from his base in Bern, maintained contact with a network of informants within the Reich that included diplomats, industrialists, religious figures, and military personnel. Through these contacts, the Allies obtained valuable information about the internal situation of Germany, about the conspirators' plans, and about the ever-deepening fissures within the regime. But, and this is crucial, the Allies never actively supported the German conspirators. They did not provide them with weapons or explosives or logistical support. They did not coordinate their plans with those of July 20th. And when the conspirators asked for guarantees that the Allies would negotiate a favourable peace with a post-Hitler Germany, the answer was always the same: unconditional surrender. No exceptions. No concessions. Why? Why didn't the Allies support those who were trying to overthrow Hitler from within? The reasons were multiple. First, there was a deep distrust of any offer coming from within Germany. The Allies suspected that the negotiations could be a trap, an attempt to divide them, to sow discord between the Anglo-Americans and the Soviets. Second, Churchill and Roosevelt had agreed with Stalin that there would be no separate peace or individual negotiations with the Germans. Supporting the conspirators would have violated that agreement and endangered the alliance. And third, there was a moral question. Many Allied leaders considered that Germany as a nation had to pay for the crimes of Nazism, not just Hitler and his circle. The idea that a group of German generals could assassinate Hitler, seize power, and then negotiate an advantageous peace, preserving the German borders of 1937 or even 1939, as some conspirators intended, was unacceptable to those who had suffered Nazi aggression. This position was understandable, but it had tragic consequences, because without Allied support, the July 20th conspirators had to act alone, with limited resources, without external backing. And when they failed, there was no one to rescue them. The final irony is that the Allied refusal to support the German resistance contributed to prolonging the war for several months. And in those months, from July 1944 to May 1945, more people died than in any comparable period of the war. It is estimated that between half and 2/3 of all war victims in Europe fell in the last year of the conflict. Millions of people, soldiers, civilians, prisoners from extermination camps who were evacuated in the so-called death marches, the endless columns of skeletal prisoners that the Nazis dragged along the roads of Germany as the front collapsed, leaving a trail of corpses in their wake. How many of those lives would have been saved if July 20th had been successful? We will never know. But the question haunts us. And speaking of questions that haunt us, there is one that is perhaps the most unsettling of all that this story raises. To what extent did the very structure of the Nazi regime make the betrayals that destroyed it inevitable? Because as we have seen, Hitler deliberately created a system of rivalries, of overlapping competencies, of institutional duplicities, where everyone watched everyone and no one trusted anyone. He did it as a control mechanism. As long as his subordinates fought among themselves, none would accumulate enough power to challenge him. But that system had a fatal flaw, and that is that the distrust that Hitler sowed among his subordinates was also, inevitably, directed towards himself. If everyone learned to lie to survive, they would also lie to him. If everyone learned that loyalty was transactional, that it was rewarded when it was convenient and punished when it was a hindrance, then no one would be genuinely loyal. The British historian Ian Kershaw has argued that Hitler's system of government contained within it the seed of its own destruction. The phrase Kershaw uses to describe the functioning of the regime is working towards the Führer. Hitler's subordinates did not need direct orders for every action. They interpreted what they believed Hitler wanted and acted accordingly, competing with each other to satisfy the leader. This mechanism allowed for an escalation of unprecedented brutality. Each subordinate tried to be more radical than the last to gain Hitler's favour, but it also generated an administrative chaos that, in the long run, undermined the efficiency of the regime. And when the war began to be lost, that same mechanism inverted. The subordinates who once competed to satisfy Hitler began to compete to distance themselves from him, to position themselves for the defeat, to look for individual ways out. Himmler negotiated with Bernadotte. Goering sent his telegram from Berchtesgaden. Speer sabotaged the Nero decree. Bormann tried to flee the bunker. Each, in his own way, betrayed the man to whom they had sworn eternal loyalty. And they did it not because they were extraordinarily evil or extraordinarily cowardly, which they also were, but because the system had trained them for it. A system where survival depended on constant adaptation, on the correct reading of political winds, on the ability to change sides at the right moment. Those skills, which had served them to climb within the regime, were the same ones they used to try to escape its ruins. The Third Reich was not destroyed only by the armies that surrounded it. It was destroyed by its own internal contradictions, by the impossibility of maintaining a system based on fear and lies. Once fear changed direction, and the lies ceased to be credible. And that is a lesson that transcends the Second World War, that transcends Nazi Germany, that speaks of something profoundly human, profoundly universal, of the fragility of systems built on distrust, of the inevitability of betrayal when loyalty is based on terror and not on conviction, of the futility of trying to control everything, because absolute control is an illusion that crumbles the moment it is most needed. Now then, there is one last chapter that we must address before closing this part of the story, a chapter that, for some reason, is usually left out of conventional narratives about the last days of the Third Reich, but which is fundamental to understanding the full dimension of the tragedy. The chapter of those who did not betray, those who remained loyal to the end, not for honour, not for valour, but for fanaticism. Because not all Nazi hierarchs tried to escape or negotiate. Some chose death, and not solitary death, but collective death, dragging their families, their subordinates, anyone within their reach, with them. We have already spoken of Goebbels and the murder of his 6 children, but it was not the only case. Throughout Germany, in those last weeks of April and May 1945, mass suicides occurred among party officials, SS officers, and their families. In some cities, entire families of Nazi officials committed suicide together. Fathers who poisoned their children before shooting themselves. Mothers who drowned their babies before taking cyanide. Officers who killed their wives and then shot themselves. The exact figures are difficult to determine, but historians estimate that several thousand Germans committed suicide in April and May 1945. In Berlin, suicides were so frequent that the hospitals, the few that were still functioning, stopped trying to save those poisoned by cyanide because they did not have the necessary resources. In the city of Demmin, in Mecklenburg, one of the largest mass suicides in history occurred. Hundreds of people took their own lives when Soviet troops entered the city, many of them drowning in the rivers that surrounded the urban centre. What prompted these mass suicides? The motivations were diverse. Some acted out of fear of Soviet reprisals, especially women who feared rape. Others, out of shame, upon understanding the magnitude of the crimes that had been committed in their name. Others, out of ideological fanaticism, because they genuinely could not conceive of a life without Nazism. And others, due to a combination of all the above. But there is a factor that is often underestimated: propaganda. For years, Goebbels had flooded the German population with stories about Bolshevik barbarism, about what the Soviets would do when they reached Germany. Mass rapes, indiscriminate murders, deportations to Siberia. And the terrifying thing is that much of that propaganda turned out to be true, although not on the apocalyptic scale that Goebbels described. The crimes committed by some units of the Red Army against the German civilian population were real and terrible, and the knowledge, or the anticipation of these crimes, pushed many people to suicide. The propaganda of fear, designed to motivate resistance, ended up causing self-destruction. Another irony in a story that is full of them. Now there is a man we have not yet spoken of, and whose story encapsulates everything we have discussed about loyalty, betrayal, fanaticism, and survival. A man who was simultaneously one of the most fanatical defenders of the regime and one of the most controversial survivors of the post-war period. Arthur Axmann. Axmann was the leader of the Hitler Youth, the organization that indoctrinated young Germans from childhood. Under his command, the Hitler Youth went from being an organization for indoctrination and sports activities to becoming, in the last months of the war, a source of cannon fodder. Axmann sent teenagers of 14, 15, and 16 years to fight against Soviet tanks with Panzerfausts, single-use anti-tank rocket launchers, and little else. Many of these children died, thousands, tens of thousands. Axmann was in Hitler's bunker on April 30th, 1945, when Hitler committed suicide. He was one of the last to see the bodies, and that night, when the mass breakout from the bunker was organized, Axmann was one of those who tried to escape. His group came across the bodies of Bormann and the SS doctor Ludwig Stumpfegger on a bridge near Lehrte station. According to Axmann, both were dead, probably from cyanide. This testimony was crucial in establishing that Bormann had died in Berlin and had not escaped to South America, as was rumoured for decades. Axmann managed to flee. He hid for months in the Bavarian Alps before being captured by the Americans in December 1945. He was tried by a denazification court and classified as a major offender, the most severe category, but was only sentenced to 3 years and 3 months in prison. After serving his sentence, he lived quietly in West Germany until his death in 1996. A man who sent thousands of children to their deaths received just over 3 years in prison. Post-war justice, it must be said, was profoundly imperfect. And this imperfection leads us to another topic we cannot ignore: the Nuremberg trials and what they meant and what they did not mean for accountability for the crimes of the Third Reich. The Nuremberg trials, held between November 1945 and October 1946, were the first attempt in history to try the leaders of a nation for crimes against humanity. 24 of the main Nazi hierarchs were accused before the International Military Tribunal. 12 were sentenced to death. 3 were acquitted. 3 were sentenced to life imprisonment. 4 received sentences of between 10 and 20 years in prison. 1. Robert Ley, the head of the German Labour Front, committed suicide before the trial, and another, Gustav Krupp, the industrialist, was declared mentally unfit to stand trial. The trials were a milestone in international law. They established principles that are still valid today, that obedience to superior orders, is not a valid defense for war crimes, that individuals, not just states, can be responsible for crimes against humanity, that there is an international law that transcends national borders. But they also had enormous limitations. Only a handful of the main responsible parties were tried. Thousands of officials, officers, industrialists, scientists and bureaucrats who had actively participated in the crimes of the regime went unpunished. Many were absorbed by the new German states, both West and East, without major consequences. Some were actively recruited by the Allies. Scientists from the SS rocket program, like Wernher von Braun, were taken to the United States as part of Operation Paperclip and contributed decisively to the American space program. Spies and intelligence officials were employed by the CIA in the Cold War. Justice, as always, was selective, and the biggest losers were, as always, the victims. The millions of Jews, Gypsies, Slavs, prisoners of war, disabled people, homosexuals, and political dissidents who were murdered by the Nazi regime and whose executioners, in many cases, never faced accountability. But there is something else that the Nuremberg trials revealed, something that connects directly to the theme of betrayals within Hitler's circle, and it is the way in which the accused behaved during the process. Because if anything characterized the Nazi hierarchs before the tribunal, it was their ability to betray each other, even after defeat. Each one blamed the others. Each one minimized their own responsibility. Each one pointed a finger at their former colleagues while proclaiming their own innocence. Göring, who was the most prominent defendant, tried to dominate the trial with his personality. He defended the regime with vigor, argued with the prosecutors, tried to present himself as a misunderstood statesman. But when he was presented with the evidence of the crimes committed, the films from the concentration camps, the testimonies of the survivors, the documents signed with his own hand, his arrogance crumbled. Speer, as we have already said, adopted the opposite strategy. He accepted moral responsibility, expressed remorse, distanced himself from the other defendants. It was the performance of his life, and it worked for him. Ribbentrop, pathetic and crumbling, could barely articulate a coherent defense. Keitel hid behind the excuse of due obedience. Jodl tried to argue that he was a simple soldier following orders. Frank, the governor of occupied Poland, converted to Catholicism in prison and expressed a remorse that some considered sincere and others considered opportunistic. Hans Frank said a phrase during the trial that has become one of the most cited from Nuremberg. 1,000 years will pass and the guilt of Germany will not be erased. A powerful phrase, but said by a man who had governed occupied Poland with a brutality that defies description, who had supervised the creation of the ghettos, who had signed the deportation orders. Can a perpetrator's remorse have any value, or is it always inevitably too late? These are questions that do not have easy answers, and perhaps they shouldn't. Now, there is a final aspect of this story that I want to explore before closing this part, because it is rarely mentioned, and yet it is fundamental to understanding the full dimension of the betrayals within the Third Reich, the everyday betrayals, the betrayals of ordinary people, because so far we have talked about generals, ministers, hierarchs, of men with names and surnames that appear in history books. But the machinery of the Third Reich did not work only because of them. It worked thanks to millions of people who, day after day, did their job, fulfilled their functions, looked the other way. The railway worker who drove the trains to Auschwitz, the official who processed the deportation orders, the neighbour who denounced his fellow tenant for listening to the BBC, the businessman who benefited from slave labour, the teacher who taught racial ideology to his students, the doctor who selected the fit and the unfit on the ramps of the extermination camps. Each of these acts was a betrayal of shared humanity, a betrayal of the implicit pact that unites us as human beings, the pact not to do unnecessary harm, to protect the vulnerable, to resist injustice, even if resisting has a cost. And this is perhaps the most important and most uncomfortable lesson of the entire history of the Third Reich. that evil does not need monsters to prosper. It needs normal people who are willing to do their job without asking too many questions, who are willing to look the other way, who are willing to say, I was just following orders, I didn't know, what could I do? The philosopher Hannah Arendt expressed it with devastating clarity when she wrote about Eichmann and coined the concept of the banality of evil. Evil, said Arendt, does not always have the face of the devil. It often has the face of the bureaucrat, of the efficient official, of the obedient citizen. And if there is one thing that the history of the betrayals within Hitler's circle teaches us, it is that blind loyalty, be it to a leader, a party, an ideology, is the most dangerous form of treason, because it betrays the only thing that really matters, our ability to think for ourselves, to judge what is right and what is wrong, to say no when everyone else says yes. The July 20th conspirators said no, late, imperfectly, with mixed motivations, but they said it, and they paid with their lives. The millions who said yes, or who simply said nothing, survived, but they carried with them, for the rest of their days, the weight of what they allowed. Who were the true traitors of the Third Reich? Those who conspired against Hitler, or those who obeyed him to the end? The answer, like everything in this story, depends on whom one was being loyal to, and that is perhaps the most important question this story leaves us with. Now then, we have not finished. There is much more to tell, more stories of betrayal that still remain hidden in the folds of history, more secrets that decades have not managed to unearth, more names that deserve to be known, and others that deserve to be remembered for the right reasons. What exactly happened to the Reichsbank's gold in the last days of the war? Who stole it? Where did it end up? And why has part of that treasure still not appeared 80 years later? What role did the Vatican play in the escape of Nazi war criminals through the so-called rat lines? How many Nazis escaped that way? And who, within the Catholic Church, facilitated these escapes? And what about the greatest betrayal of all, the one that no one usually mentions, the betrayal of memory, the fact that, even today, there are those who deny the Holocaust, those who relativize the crimes of Nazism, those who rewrite history to soften the unbearable. All these questions deserve answers, and they will have them. But for that, we need you to stay here. Don't go away. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this story, because the more the past is known, the harder it is to repeat it. Let's now turn to a chapter that, due to its secret nature, took decades to come to light. A chapter that involves espionage, double agents, and a betrayal so sophisticated that not even the most advanced intelligence services in the world managed to unravel it completely until long after the war had ended. The story of the Red Circle, the network of Soviet spies that operated within the heart of the Third Reich. Because when we talk about betrayals within Hitler's circle, we tend to think of military conspiracies, of the generals who wanted to assassinate him, of the hierarchs who negotiated behind his back with the Western allies. But there was another kind of betrayal, much more silent, much more effective, and much more damaging to the German war effort. The betrayal of those who spied for the Soviet Union. The Rote Kapelle, the Red Orchestra, as the Gestapo called it, was one of the most extraordinary espionage networks of the Second World War. It was not a single organization, but a set of semi-independent networks and groups that operated in Germany, Belgium, France, and other countries, providing information to Soviet intelligence. The most important group operated in Berlin, and its members were not professional agents sent from Moscow. They were Germans, government officials, army officers, intellectuals, artists, people who held positions within the Nazi state apparatus, and who, out of ideological conviction, anti-fascism, or both, transmitted secret information to the Soviets. The leader of the Berlin group was Harro Schulze-Boysen, a Luftwaffe officer who worked in Goering's Ministry of Aviation. He had access to classified information on air operations, armaments production, and strategic plans. His most important collaborator was Arvid Harnack, an official in the Ministry of Economics, who provided data on German industrial production and the economic situation of the Reich. Together, Schulze-Boysen and Harnack led a network of more than 100 people who, for years, filtered vital information to the Soviets. They alerted Moscow to the plans for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, weeks before it was launched. They provided data on the production of planes, tanks, and ammunition. They transmitted information on troop movements and operational plans. Did Stalin heed their warnings? Not always. When Schulze-Boysen and other agents warned of the imminent German invasion in June 1941, Stalin dismissed the information as British disinformation, designed to provoke a war between Germany and the USSR. That decision cost the Soviet Union millions of lives. The Rote Kapelle was dismantled in 1942, when the Gestapo and the Abwehr managed to decipher the radio transmissions that the spies used to communicate with Moscow. The repression was brutal. More than 100 people were arrested. Schulze-Boysen, Harnack, their wives Libertas and Mildred, and dozens of others were executed. Many were guillotined or hanged. Mildred Harnack, an American by birth, was first sentenced to prison, but Hitler personally annulled the sentence and ordered the death penalty. She was beheaded on February 16, 1943. The cruelty of the repression against the Rote Kapelle reflects the panic that the existence of spies within the government itself generated in the regime. If there were traitors in the Luftwaffe, in the Ministry of Economics, where else were they? How many secrets had been leaked? How much did the Soviets know? The answer was a lot, more than the Nazis could imagine, and the information provided by the Rote Kapelle contributed significantly to the Soviet capacity to resist and eventually defeat the Wehrmacht. But there is something profoundly paradoxical in this story. The members of the Rote Kapelle were, from the perspective of the Nazi regime, traitors. They were people who had sworn loyalty to the German state and who violated that oath by spying for a foreign power. But from another perspective, a moral perspective, they were resistors, people who opposed a criminal regime and who paid with their lives for that opposition. Which of these perspectives is correct? It depends on how loyalty is defined. If loyalty is owed to the state, no matter what that state does, then they were traitors. But if loyalty is owed to higher principles, justice, humanity, decency, then they were heroes. And this dilemma, this conflict between loyalty to power and loyalty to conscience, is the thread that runs through the entire story we have told today. What is more valuable, obedience or integrity, duty or humanity, loyalty to the leader or loyalty to what is right? The last days of the Third Reich gave clear answers to these questions, but they were answers written in blood, with suffering, with the destruction of entire nations, and the price of learning them was so high that humanity cannot afford to forget them. Let's now turn to another episode that few people know, but which illustrates in an extraordinary way how betrayals branched out to the most unexpected levels of the regime. The story of Henning von Tresckow and the bomb on Hitler's plane. Long before July 20th, 1944, long before Stauffenberg, there was an assassination attempt that was an instant away from changing history. And it failed for a reason that seems taken from a bad movie. The cold. On March 13th, 1943, Colonel Henning von Tresckow, an officer on the General Staff of Army Group Center on the Eastern Front, carried out one of the most ingenious and audacious attempts to kill Hitler. Tresckow was, along with Stauffenberg, one of the masterminds of the military resistance against the regime. From his position on the front, he had organized a network of conspirators ready to act. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Hitler visited the headquarters of Army Group Center in Smolensk. During the visit, Tresckow asked one of the officers in Hitler's entourage Colonel Heinz Brandt. Yes, the same Brandt who months later would move Stauffenberg's briefcase under the table to carry a package to the army headquarters in the rear. The package, Tresco said, contained 2 bottles of Cointreau that were a gift for a friend. The bottles were not bottles, they were explosives. Bombs disguised as liquor. Tresco activated the detonator, and Brandt got on Hitler's plane with the package. The plane took off. Tresco and his accomplice, Lieutenant Fabian von Schlabrendorf, waited. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. The plane landed in Rastenburg. Hitler got out alive, unscathed, without knowing that he had travelled for hours with a bomb just a few meters away. What had happened? The detonator had not worked. The bomb's mechanism used a chemical system that depended on acid to corrode a wire that would release a firing pin. But in the plane's cargo hold, where the package was stored, the temperature was extremely low, and the cold slowed down the chemical reaction until it stopped completely. The acid simply did not corrode the wire in time. The moment of horror that Tresco and Schlabrendorf must have experienced when they learned that Hitler had landed alive is hard to imagine. Not only had the plan failed, but now there was a package of explosives with their metaphorical fingerprints on Hitler's plane. If someone found it, if someone opened it, they were dead. Schlabrendorf acted with extraordinary cold-bloodedness. He took the first plane to Rastenburg, contacted Brandt, told him there had been a mix-up and that he had given him the wrong bottles, and retrieved the package. Then in his room, he disarmed the bomb with trembling hands and discovered that the detonator had partially worked. The acid had corroded the wire. The firing pin had struck the capsule, but the capsule had not detonated. The extreme cold not only slowed the chemical reaction, but it also affected the sensitivity of the detonator cap. The margin between Hitler's life and death was, literally, a few degrees of temperature. What would have happened if it had been a little warmer that day? If the plane's cargo hold had been a few degrees warmer? If the detonator had worked as designed? The plane would have exploded in mid-flight. Hitler would have died. There would have been no survivors to tell what happened, and history would have attributed the death to an accident or an enemy attack. The conspirators would have been free of suspicion. The coup d'etat would have been executed with a crucial advantage. No one would have known that Hitler was assassinated. But it didn't happen. And Tresco, far from giving up, continued to conspire. He kept looking for opportunities. He kept risking his life. And when the July 20th plot also failed, when he knew that all was lost, Tresco walked towards the Soviet lines on the Eastern Front and blew his head off with a hand grenade. He did it so that it would look like a death in combat, to protect his family from reprisals. Before dying, he said some words to Schlabrendorf that have become the epitaph of the entire German resistance. Now the whole world will attack us and cover us with insults, but I am still absolutely convinced that we did the right thing. I believe that Hitler is the arch-enemy not only of Germany, but of the entire world. When in a few hours I stand before God, I will be able to justify what I did, just as God promised Abraham that he would not destroy Sodom if he found 10 righteous men. I hope that for our sake, God will not destroy Germany. These words resonate through the decades, not only for their eloquence, but for what they reveal about the state of mind of a man who knew he was going to die, who knew he had failed, and yet still believed the attempt had been worthwhile. That resistance against evil has value in itself, regardless of the outcome. Tresco did not live to see the end of the war. He did not live to see the Nuremberg trials, nor the reconstruction of Germany, nor the eventual rehabilitation of his memory. But his legacy endures, and his story, along with those of Stauffenberg, Canaris, Auster, Bonhoeffer, and so many others, reminds us that even in the most absolute darkness, there are people who choose the light. Now, there is one last twist in this story that we cannot fail to tell, because the betrayals within Hitler's circle did not end with the fall of Berlin. They continued, transformed in the post-war period, and some of them had consequences that reached decades later. Did you know that several of the men closest to Hitler became informants for Allied intelligence services after the war? That some of the worst war criminals of the Third Reich were protected, employed, and financed by the United States and Great Britain during the Cold War? The transition from the Second World War to the Cold War created an extraordinarily cynical situation. The Western Allies, who had fought against Nazism for 6 years, suddenly found themselves facing a new enemy, the Soviet Union. And to combat the Soviets, they needed information. Information about Eastern Europe, about Soviet intelligence networks, about the military capabilities of the Red Army. And who had that information? The Germans. The same Germans who had fought against the Soviets for 4 years. The same Germans who had operated espionage networks in Eastern Europe. The same Germans who, in many cases, had participated in the most atrocious crimes of the war. Reinhard Gehlen is perhaps the most spectacular example. Gehlen had been the head of the Eastern Front intelligence section of the OKH, Fremde Heere Ost, responsible for analysing the capabilities and movements of the Red Army. When the war ended, Gehlen surrendered to the Americans, bringing with him microfilms of all the information his department had compiled on the Soviet Union. The Americans immediately realised the value of that material, and instead of trying Gehlen for his crimes, or at least investigating them, they employed him. The Gehlen Organization, as it became known, became the main instrument of United States espionage against the Soviet Union in Europe. It employed hundreds of ex-Nazi officers, many of them with criminal records. It operated with American funding but with considerable autonomy, and eventually in 1956 it was transformed into the BND, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the Federal Intelligence Service of the Federal Republic of Germany, with Gehlen as its first director. The head of post-war Germany's espionage was an ex-Nazi officer who had worked for Hitler. The irony is almost unbearable. And the crimes, the atrocities, the millions of dead, they were buried under the logic of the Cold War. The priority was no longer justice. It was security. And in the name of security, pacts were made with the devil. This is not a metaphor. It is literally what happened. And it is a form of betrayal that is often overlooked. A betrayal not of the Nazis against Hitler, but of the Allies against the principles for which they had supposedly fought. The promise of never again, pronounced over the corpses of the concentration camps, was subordinated to the geopolitical needs of the New World Order. And so, many of the men who had served the most criminal regime in history found a new job, a new purpose, a new life. Not because they repented, not because they had changed, but because they were useful. Utility, in the end, turned out to be a more effective passport than innocence. Is this a betrayal? And if it is, a betrayal of whom? Of the victims of Nazism, of the principles of international law, of historical truth? These are questions that still have no satisfactory answer. And perhaps that is the greatest betrayal of all, that 80 years later, we have not yet found a way to reconcile justice with politics, memory with convenience, truth with power. But what we can do is remember what happened, remember who was responsible, remember who resisted, and remember that every time we look the other way, every time we choose convenience over justice, every time we decide that certain crimes are forgivable if the criminal is useful enough, we are perpetuating the same logic that made the Third Reich possible.